welcome to this sixth week of Philosophy in the City, the last week actually, and we began with a Serenade to Pepco by Fastball, and I hope everyone is with power, and if you're not, hopefully you get it soon. I'm not sure how you're watching this, probably somewhere else, but what we're going to talk about today are about how we experience cities, and so this is going to touch on the reading the book by Lynch, which you read 2 chapters from and skimmed the others. And I'm going to avoid talking directly about it because I think it's pretty clear what he's saying there, but I want to talk more about something he sort of touches on but then passes up, and that's how different sorts of people experience cities in different ways and what this can tell us about how we should design cities. But first, I'm going to talk about something that we're familiar with, and we're going to try to learn something from our power outage. So, what can the fact that we have these frequent power outages tell us something about what we value or what we're choosing for our city? So, it's often thought that Pepco is a terrible company. There's something wrong with the utility or something like that. They can't get us back online, and that's what's wrong. So this is usually what politicians say. But there's a more complicated thing going on here, and it has to do mostly with how we have decided to build our city. And one way that we could avoid most of our outages would be to bury our lines. So if you look around the DC area, you'll see most lines are not buried, at least outside the center city. And where you do see buried lines, or where you don't see them, but where there are buried lines, when you don't see the power lines everywhere strung up in various places, power rarely goes out. This is pretty well known. And usually what causes power to go out are trees falling on power lines. And so one way of getting around this is to bury them. But these lines are very expensive to bury, especially after the fact. So it's a little cheaper to bury them in a new development, but even that adds price to the homes. And so this requires us to choose something. Do we spend the extra money, or do we not? And it seems like we have a few choices. And remember going back to social choice, it seems like we want to get some sort of decision out of people as a group, and government is one way we might be able to do that, although it's problematic. And so when we complain about ourselves having all these outages, when we sit in our homes without power on 100-degree days, and we think about how much this sucks, we need to think about how we got here. And here are 3 of the choices we could have, and these are just 3 that I've listed. There are many others, I'm sure. So we could of course go with our current situation of relatively low rates for our area. So we have other issues that might require higher rates than some other area, but given our area, we have lower rates than if we buried all of our lines. But we have annual, it seems, outages, right? So it seems like we have a major event every year, and a lot of us lose power. And we also have relatively low density, and so low density makes it very expensive to have buried wires. And in fact, you rarely see, at least in our area, buried lines in low density areas. In high density areas, you do, because it makes sense. It makes economical sense. In other areas of the country, in other countries, good Lord, in Europe, they would think we're crazy for putting up all of these power lines, and most of them are buried there. And, as well as other parts of the country, they often bury lines. And so we could choose 2 different sorts of things. One thing we could choose is we could choose to have higher density. So we could choose to leave our suburban homes, and in fact, those who still are without power on it's a Tuesday, are likely those living in lower density areas. So I live in a higher density area, and I almost always get my power back far earlier than people who live in a single family home or something. So we could choose that, and that would decrease the price we'd have to pay, or decrease the distributed price we'd have to pay for the buried lines. And that might be a way to go. Or we could pay higher rates, so we could pay more money and have the same service as high density with less money, but retain our low density. And so as you sort of sit and reflect on what sort of choices as a city got us here, and as you maybe listen to the radio and have or hear people talk about, okay, why is this happening? Think carefully about what sort of social choices have gotten us here. And one thing you might think is that, well, it's kind of reflecting what we value. It seems like we don't want them to raise rates. We don't want to pay for buried lines. I think what I heard was it would cost about $4 billion to bury the lines in the metropolitan DC area. I don't know if that's the entire area, but in most of the area. That's a metro system, right? So that's about the price of the metro system. Metro system was a little more, but to build. But that's a lot of money, right? And that's why people sort of say, oh, we should bury lines, but then they sort of back away from that. So it seems like what we do is we accept these outages. We don't want to pay the money, every single month, and accept, to have 4 or so days without power, and losing all our food, and being in an unpleasant situation. Okay, so just think about this a little, and because I think it's an interesting case of some of the things we've been talking about. But let's move on to the subject of today's lecture, and what I'll talk about sort of comes from Lynch's book. And he thinks that various different types of urban designs, so he talks about specific features of urban designs which cause us to have certain experiences of a city. So what he doesn't talk about are really the economic or behavioral outcomes of these things, right? So that's what Jacobs was really concerned about. Certain sorts of development might kill a city or might kill a neighborhood in certain ways. It might drive out businesses. It might cause people to act in certain ways. It might bring crime in. Those are all behavioral and economic considerations. Lynch is concerned with how you experience a city given certain features. Just so make sure to recognize that this is a very different sort of different sort of question than what Milgram and Jacobs were talking about. So Milgram and Jacobs, remember Milgram was talking about, okay, why are people acting, so almost cruelly or indifferent to each other in cities, and he gave various reasons for that. And Jacobs was talking about, okay, these structures are causing people to behave in certain ways. She was also concerned about experience, but she was centered on how cities and the way they're built sort of affect the way people act. And Lynch is really not talking much about them. So what I'm going to talk about is how we experience different environments, especially urban environments, and how different people experience the same urban environment. And this is, so the second part of that is notably different from what Lynch is doing. He mentions this. He says, yes, people who have different experiences, different features will experience places in a different way. And that's what I want to concentrate on in this lecture. Like Lynch, I'll be concerned with the determinants of experience. So when Lynch says that certain features, like nodes or paths, these features of cities, how those determine how people experience them, holding, people constant, right? So consider some, all people sort of on average or something, and then think about how they experience the city given that we vary these sorts of features. In that way, we can say that these features determine certain aspects of the experience. I'll be doing the opposite, in a way. So what I'll be saying is, okay, let's hold environments constant and change people, over people. And then see, okay, if we change features of the people, how does that affect their experience of the same environment? Um, so this will involve some generalizations about the sorts of people that encounter environments. So we'll put them in certain categories to make things simpler. But remember that people vary in many different ways, and however we talk about people, it's going to be a simplification. And so I'm going to just list some of the features of people that might be important for this. One is certainly knowledge. So this is certainly important for Lynch's issue of legibility, right? So he thinks that if an environment is legible, right, if it's easy to process in certain ways, it's a better environment on average. So what we can also claim, though, is that if someone knows more about an environment or has more experience with it, this legibility can diminish in significance. So you can have very complicated environments which might not have the sort of order that Lynch thinks is really important, and yet they might be desirable if people know a lot about them or if people have lots of experiences with them. And so you might imagine, so some environments, so you might think of like streets or something, which there might be almost no pattern to how streets go back and forth, or if you're going down a street, you might not know where you'll go next. And if you're familiar with the street, that won't really hinder your experience of it. But as Lynch says, if you're not familiar with the street, you'll probably feel lost and sort of worried. So if some streets make the sort of turns that Lynch thought were a terrible idea, right? If they sort of disorient you in certain ways, if you're unfamiliar with them, that's bad if you don't know where they actually go. But if you know where they go, it might be fun, right? It might be really nice to go down this path which sort of disorients you in various ways, and so that's going to be important. And also, the ends and preferences of people. So what do people want out of the environment? So we'll be talking in a second about some examples of this, but certainly someone who really wants to find something to eat will not be satisfied with a single-use suburban neighborhood or a forest or something, right? So on the edge of a neighborhood or something. What they want is a place full of businesses and a place where they can select something to eat. However, if what they really wanted to do was go walk in the woods or have a peaceful trip somewhere and they don't really want to get any food or anything, then such environments where that are lacking in food options or lacking in sort of this urban character are fine for them. They might actually like them more. And so we can see that these can be sort of transient ends and purposes, but also more longer lasting ones, or stable ones. You might think that certain sorts of people like generally very active environments. They like it when there's big crowds. They like Times Square or something. And others might hate that sort of environment. It might disorient them in various ways. And so you can see that people with different preferences for environments might look at the same environment very differently. And also, people have different histories and past experiences, and you can lump it with this, various features of, how did they grow up, and what sort of culture did they grow up, and also what they can infer from what they're seeing. So, for example, when someone sees usually in the United States, if you see one business, you can usually infer that there might be others around it. So it's very rare for you to come across maybe a restaurant or something, at least in cities, and for it to be alone, right? So often there's certain zoning ordinances that make it such that these businesses are all in sort of one place. And so if you have those sorts of experiences, you sort of are familiar with how cities do this, and how, okay, if I come across one restaurant, there might be others, or it might be a store. then, if you see just one store out of the corner of your eye and you need something that store might not have, you might want to go investigate anyway, right? So, and this is the only, you need to know these sorts of things to make such inferences. And so this might also be important. So, I mean, coming to the sort of end of this list, what this tells us is that we can't ask general questions necessarily about what we should build without knowing who we're building for. So when you say that a garden city has various drawbacks, you might not be able to say that without qualifying it, based upon certain sorts of people living there, or people in certain cultures, or people in certain who have certain needs or whatever, or preferences. Because you might think there's many people who would be fine living in garden cities or whatever. So, and we'll get to this further, but we need to think about who we're building for as we think about what we should build. I'm pretty sure all of us have probably been to the National Mall, and this really gives us a nice example of how different sorts of people can have different experiences with the same environment and different feelings about the same environment. They can, experience it in very different ways. So we might start by considering a tourist, the standard person who comes to visit Washington, D.C., for the various, things that are here because it's the capital of the United States, right? They're not interested in necessarily neighborhoods or whatnot. They're interested in the sort of things that are here because it's the capital, like the White House, or the Supreme Court, or the Capitol, or the museums, or all the monuments. So these sorts of things. So you might think they're more interested in seeing impressive things. So they're more interested in seeing this sort of view, right? I mean, this is an impressive sight to see. It's beautiful in certain ways, but you might also just be sort of awestruck by it in certain other ways, especially if you aren't used to seeing this. It's also very easy to navigate, and you can see where everything is, right? So you think to yourself, this is at the foot of the Capitol roughly, and you think to yourself, I want to go to the Lincoln Memorial, or I want to go to, that's here if you don't know, or I want to go to the Washington Monument, or I want to go to the Art Museum. I think that's it. I know it's on that side. You can see it. It's the geometry is easy. It's pretty easy to understand what's going on here, and the directions are very simple. Lots of landmarks. So that's nice for a tourist. You can know that where the museums are. Well, they're along here, and they're along here, and so that makes navigation really easy. And museums provide all these new experiences. The monuments are interesting in various ways, and there's a lot of restaurants here that sort of cater to outsiders, right? They cater to people who know national brands and don't know any local ones, so they might feel more comfortable with restaurants or whatever that they recognize. And so you'll see pretty readily that of course there's McDonald's in the Smithsonian, there's cafeterias in the various museums, and even to the north here, right, they call it Penn Quarter, there's a lot of chain sandwich shops and such. And so this environment sort of lends itself to a person who isn't really interested in the city itself, but rather just in this sort of environment to see certain things. They're here as tourists. They're touring. It's very different for someone who lives in Washington, D.C. A lot of people really dislike going down to the mall. It's large. It sort of gets in the way of traveling. It has this, it's kind of a pain to get around in certain ways, because you might be traveling along the grid system in DC, and then all of a sudden, bam, you have this huge field you have to walk across, which is especially bad on a hot day. You've seen these buildings many times. You're no longer impressed perhaps by the monuments or by the Capitol. You don't really care anymore. it's just not interesting anymore. It's lost the sort of charm or the sort of awesomeness which you might have experienced when you were a tourist or when you first came here. And as anyone who probably knows, who's been down to the mall and tried to get a really good restaurant, it's sort of hard, especially for something that's not expensive. So there's definitely things that are lacking, and if you're on the mall itself, it is especially hard, especially the south side, to find anything other than McDonald's or something that's just a cheap sandwich shop or something. And so you might think if your ends, or if you happen to be here and one of your ends is, well, I want to find something really good to eat, it might be more difficult here. And you don't need these simple geometry. You are a local, so you can figure things out in a different way. And so this is sort of what we're talking about. You can have two different people. They might be even similar in other features, right? They might have similar backgrounds. It might be let's just say they're middle class, similar cultures even, and yet because of the sort of interest they have in the environment, they look at it very differently. So often locals treat the mall as a place to jog or something, and they aren't as interested in seeing the sights. Very different sort of environment is the north end of Boston, and this is the neighborhood that Jane Jacobs was talking about when she was discussing that a lot of people thought of it as a slum, and yet had excellent sort of urban design in her view. And lo and behold, in 2012, this is one of the great success stories of gentrification. It's actually quite nice and quite desirable, especially given its location. It's right by downtown Boston. So what can we say about this sort of environment? What might a tourist think? Well, Boston is notorious for being difficult to navigate. It's one of the, a lot of people say it's one of the worst places to try to find something in. If you're not counting in like using smartphones or something, it's just the street system doesn't make any sense. There's like different sorts of kind of grids colliding together in various ways, unlike the DC system, which is coherent and it's coherent and whole. And even has a quadrant system that lets you know exactly where you are, pretty much. Boston lacks that. At least it's not apparent to people who aren't from there. And so even if there is some order, it takes a lot to get to know. It's similar to New York's system. Its street system is actually quite easy for people who've been there a little while to understand, but it's more difficult than something like DC system. So that you have this sort of gradation. And you look here, it's not as impressive in certain ways as the mall. It's also less clear, like any neighborhood like this, where did tourists eat? What's good? I don't know what's good, again, without like a smartphone and looking on Yelp or something. I might not even recognize a restaurant from something else. This sometimes happens in certain neighborhoods. And so, this is less desirable, and also it's unclear, and this happens many times in gentrifying places. Your cues of safety are sort of off. You don't often know which places are sort of considered safe, and which places you should really stay away from. For instance, this isn't a North End example, but so just if you're familiar with DC, so just sort of north of 14th Street in U, northwest in DC, between that and the Columbia Heights Metro, is far, there's a lot more crime in that sort of small stretch than there is to the north of that stretch or the south of that stretch. And it's hard. I mean, the reason is perhaps because they have there's a lot of low-income housing there, and you have some gangs there, but for the person who doesn't really know anything about the neighborhood, that's impossible to know. And so if you're trying to make a decision of whether it's safe to walk around at 1 a.m., your decision for south of this area might be different than in that area, right? And locals kind of know these things. They tell each other these things, but tourists don't know these things. These aren't widely available facts. They're sort of known in the community, um, and so this is sort of problematic for tourists. So you need to sort of recognize that this is a real issue for them. For a local, though, as is clear from its it's fetching rather high rents now. It's a very the North End is rather desirable. The streets can be known well enough once you know the neighborhood. There's lots of it has a really interesting history. It's a very old neighborhood, so there's lots of unmarked landmarks that are sort of have an interesting story to them. And great. You might think there's great businesses there. There's cheaper rent in other areas around. And so some people really like this, and especially people who like these sorts of urban environments, the sort of Jacobs urban environments, and that really changes how you should view this place, depending upon the sort of person you are, the sort of preferences you have, the sort of interests you have in the environment. What can we conclude from this? Well, it kind of tells us that we need to answer more questions than we thought we did. So before, it seemed like we could get away with just asking, okay, what is the best way to design a city? What is the best sort of form? What are the best sort of functions within that city? And once we answered that question, we could just go about designing our cities and looking to see what we should do. However, it seems like we need to know who's going to live there. So we need to sort of answer the question of who matters most. Who do we want this living environment to work for? Some environments. So of course my answer to this is going to be, well, it depends, because I'm not giving any answers. But in many cases it's going to be residents, right? So this is the big problem, is that it seems like many times people want a neighborhood to look really impressive, or to serve customers really well, and they leave out the fact that this is going to be a place people have to live. So what is the proper role of city design? Well, you might think this is what Jacobs thinks, is to make good living neighborhoods, good neighborhoods in which people can live a fulfilling life. But you also might think there's other places where tourists really should be looked after, where the interests of tourists are what are important. And you might think city centers serve this sort of role. So should we just build a bunch of apartment buildings right on the mall? Well, maybe not, because this might detract from the tourist-centered nature of the mall. And the same thing, you might think some shopping areas really should be best for customers. They should be best for these businesses, not necessarily for the residents. And so we needn't think that every environment needs to be great for people living there. Maybe some shouldn't be, but it seems like there's a good chunk that should be. And so what we really need to figure out, and at least answer this question partially, we don't need to be completely sure, is what sort of main function we want the area to serve, or at least what mixture of functions. And so you might have living environments, working environments, economic centers, cultural centers, places of sort of historical or national significance, like the mall, like the National Mall. And which choice you make here, so which one of these you choose, is really going to affect what you think you should build and what the best place is for your purpose. The general lesson then seems to be that if we want to think about different types of urban design, or just environmental design in general, we need to keep it in context. And the context needs to be the people who will be using it. And if you have different sorts of people with different experiences, people who like different things, and you put them in the wrong environment, you give them the wrong environment, they'll have experiences that are far worse than what you might think, and the sort of behaviors you might engender in them also could be much worse than other designs. So let's take a few examples. For instance, garden cities, and also modernist sort of cities where you have high rises and then expanses of various sorts. So garden cities are supposed to be in, in green areas, and modernist cities were either in, green areas or just expanses of concrete and such, which are supposed to impress. These might work for college campuses. And there are sort of contexts in which this does work. You might think there's many dorms that are kind of like this, and they work okay. They don't really produce much crime. People, they're cheap. People, like living in them okay. I mean, it doesn't help that they're often cheaply built. And so you might think the environment is worse inside because of that, not just because of the design. But these sort of structures are generally considered to be relative successes on college campuses, and they came out of this sort of garden city idea, and also modernism. But in the realm of public housing, another major area where they were implemented, they're a terrible failure, especially the modernist buildings. So, and why is this? Well, college students are really strange, and college campuses are very strange. And so you can't really take an environment that works for them in that context, in that place, and apply it to a low-income group of people living where the public housing is probably in a worse area, a higher crime area. And so, college students are very unlikely to commit crimes. They're very unlikely to know people who commit crimes or be associated with them. And they're very unlikely to live in areas with high crime rates. College campuses have very low crime rates typically. Whereas public housing typically is located in places with high crime rates, and people in public housing often know people or have to deal with people who have committed crimes or may in the future. And so this is a major problem that you need to account for. You need to allow people who live in public housing to have security, so that there have to be certain structural features of their buildings that allow them to observe outside the building, observe the corridors, observe various things, and this helps decrease crime in these contexts. And so even though in college campuses this might be a success, in public housing it's not, and maybe they need something more like the Jacob-style urbanism. But then moving to Jacob-style urbanism, it seems like for many people who just don't like living in an urban environment, right? They might like peace and quiet more than other things, more than the vibrancy of a Jacob-style urbanism. They just really don't want to live there. And so why should you force them to live there? And why should you build an entire city in this sort of image if many of the people don't want to live there? And so it's important to understand what sort of people you have in the city. What do they prefer? What are their backgrounds? In order to know what might produce the best experiences with them, what might produce the best behaviors, the most pro-social behaviors in various people. So, really, the overall lesson is that we have to understand a lot to be able to solve the question of what sort of style of urbanism we should use, or what sort of style of environment we should live in. And this is no easy question. And so, as I've usually done, I've left you with probably more questions than answers, but hopefully this starts you thinking about this. Okay, so that finishes this first lecture. I will have a concluding lecture next time. It's gonna, I'll be concluding sort of the class. Just we'll kind of talk about some things we've gone over in the class, and talk about where is the city going. And this is going to touch on the issue of placemaking, which has become very important. I've given you 2 readings about what places are in the sort of urban studies context. So keep going with your final and your paper, and keep me posted if you have any more power issues or if anything comes up. And I'll see you later.